Good morning all. Thank you very much for joining us here today for this morning panel discussing how we communicate net zero. There's been a lot of growing anti-net zero narrative in the political sphere and also through the media recently. Kemi Badenoch labelled it impossible. Nigel Farage said it's lunacy. Tony Blair said short-term plans to phase out fossil fuels are doomed to fail. So today we're exploring if and how net zero is being used as a political wedge issue. If so, is this symptomatic of the way the concept has been communicated? And if not, what other factors are there to consider? So today we're joined by a wonderful panel with a breadth of experience across politics, media, planning. So if I can just hand over to introduce yourself, just who you are, where you're from, and a little bit about kind of what your role consists of. Should we start the other end at Megan?
Yeah, hi all, I'm Megan Corton Scott. I'm the Deputy Director of the Labour Climate and Environment Forum. I have spent a decade in and around the Labour Party and more recently in and around climate politics, and now I'm very lucky in that I get to do both of those things in my day job. Labour Climate and Environment Forum is a relatively new organisation in Westminster. We're 2.5 years old. We are an independent organisation, not affiliated to or partisan to the Labour Party. We work across the Labour movement. So yes, of course, that includes our PLP and ministers and advisors and so on, but also trade unions, affiliated societies, think tanks, etc. And we aim to lift the climate and environment ambition and also knowledge across the Labour movement and make the case that it is the right thing for the country and the right thing for the party.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jillian Ambrose. I'm the Guardian's energy correspondent. I've been there for about 6 years, and before that I was the energy editor at the Daily Telegraph. So hopefully I can speak to the range of views on net zero that are available. Before that I've worked in the trade press, so in all about 15 years writing about the energy industry, in a time in which a lot has changed and a lot has stayed exactly the same. So hoping to look into both sides of that today.
I'm Luke Murphy. I'm the Member of Parliament for Basingstoke. I also sit on the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee. The committee has got a whole range of inquiries at the moment, including one that's really relevant to this topic about how we make sure we maintain support for the energy transition. And just last week we had a number of pollsters in front of us talking about this very issue and how we communicate it. I'm also chair of the All-Party Group on Climate Change, and before I was elected last year, I ran the energy and climate team at the think tank IPPR, and long before that I was a Labour Party political advisor and worked in financial services. So yeah, that's me.
Morning everyone, Roy Pinnock. I'm head of planning at Dentons, which is a global law firm. I've been involved in built environment debates and regeneration projects for about 20 years. I started my career in Lambeth, London Borough of Lambeth, back in the late 90s. And then sort of made my way to being a lawyer, and I thought it would be best to people with real jobs to do their introductions first. You know, I act for M&S and have been acting for them for several years in relation to their marble arch store. We also do work across the renewable sector and the non-renewable sector, as well as a range of estate regeneration, major projects, and I advise the UK government in that capacity as well. So I'm here to learn, but might have a few things to say as well.
Lovely. Well, thank you all very much for joining us this morning. So this is a question which will go for the whole panel, but Luke, if we can kick off with yourself, kind of what do you think are the key reasons behind the backlash against net zero that we're seeing from certain political quarters at the moment?
Yeah, and I think it obviously is quite stark, the positioning of Reform and the Conservatives. I think one thing I would say before we kind of get into exactly why that is happening is that I don't think we should be too downhearted about public support for tackling climate change. It still maintains vast majority support over all demographics and all geographies and all age groups across the country around tackling climate change. Yes, it's kind of has shifted a little bit, but that support overall remains high. Support for net zero also remains high and is a net positive in every single voter demographic for every single political party, with the exception of Reform. Yes, it's narrow for the Conservatives. But that is the case. I think what's happened is a number of things. Firstly, we've obviously got to the crunchier part of the transition, and something that I was working on when I was at IPPR, which is this is the part of the transition where you're not doing it in the background in the energy market. You're doing it where it affects people's lives, how they get around, how they heat their home, and potentially things around diet and things like that. So these are the crunchy things that affect how people live. But we've also moved into we've been in a living standards crisis for quite some time, but that is more acute now than it has been for some time. So where support becomes less clear, I think, is where people feel like it's going to impose costs on them. Now, I don't think that's necessarily about a kind of people associate net zero as like high cost. It's just that people are understandably under a great deal of pressure. They're worried about their living standards and they're worried about anything that might cost them money. So there's issues, and I think what Reform and Conservatives are doing they are trying to that they are essentially trying to exploit that. The thing I would say is that, and that obviously has some impacts. One of the most interesting things from the witnesses that came to see the Select Committee last week, a session I had with the polling group Persuasion yesterday, is that has how much political leadership has impacted actually on their voter bloc. So we're nowhere near America and the polarisation of America, and I think all the data bears that out. But the change of the position of the leader of the Conservative Party and Farage has changed the opinion. They have led the opinion to a certain extent, or shifted the opinion of some of their party political supporters. So that obviously is a concern, but it's not just about them. It is actually, there are some fundamental issues that we need to be ruthlessly focused on, not least cost. It's incredibly important, but support there is high. But yes, I think those are the reasons why they think they've seen an opportunity, but I do think they are in danger of overplaying their hand from a political point of view, and I think Labour is in exactly the right place, because there is lots of economic benefit, security benefit, the benefit of actually tackling climate change in and of itself, and also a political benefit to be seen to be taking leadership on this issue, but doing it in a way that is conscious of the impacts it's going to have on people's finances.
Any further comments, Megan, maybe from yourself, on kind of some of the root causes behind it being used as a political wedge issue?
I mean, obviously, I agree with Luke. I think we can't understate just how important the Uxbridge by-election was in July 2023 for the Conservatives. I think Reform is slightly different, and it is interesting in that, it's completely right to say that Reform takes a lot of steers from the American right, which has huge vested interests in oil and gas, and therefore I think that America is just polarised in a completely different way than we are here to climate change, but also in a way that's very similar is the kind of political ideology, I think, behind Reform, which is like enormously free market ideology, not necessarily actually in terms of some of the economic policies they're putting forward to, but in the idea of kind of liberalism and freedom of choice. I mean, we saw this with the banking row with Nigel Farage a couple of years ago, where the reason that hit home so much was about somebody being stopped about accessing something purely because of their political beliefs, that the state or that big institutions or that elites can impose an ideology or a viewpoint onto ordinary people, and that everybody has to kind of fall in line. And so that's something that's been really consistent with Nigel Farage, despite his many iterations and many parties, and now kind of the changing nature of the Reform economic policy. And so I think net zero is very much in that camp of something that is imposed and it's very top-down led, and that's kind of why he's galvanising and railing against it as a policy. With the Conservatives, I don't think it's ideological, to be blunt. I think it is politically manufactured and convenient. They are the party of net zero, actually. Theresa May, Boris Johnson, really strong leaders, both globally and nationally, on climate. And I think Harry Quilter-Pinnock, who's now the director of the IPPR, always said, Labour and Conservatives, we might not have agreed on the on how to get there, but we always agreed on the end point, and that feels like that's really fractured in the past few years. And I think that the Uxbridge by-election has a lot to blame for that, which I won't majorly go into because we could discuss for the entirety of the panel, but I think it gave the Conservatives at their real lowest ebb a playbook that they took and they ran with because they had really nothing else. And I think that that is not only making them more like Reform and failing to put dividing lines between what their policies are and what their party looks like and Reform does, but also is losing them, their kind of core climate-minded voters, a lot of whom went to the Liberal Democrats and also to Labour in the last election.
Jillian, Roy, I'm kind of interested, kind of outside looking in to Westminster, any of your analysis on some of the narrative that's playing out at the moment?
I mean, you can't get better than that kind of setup from these two. That's spot on. That's sort of what we're seeing. I think what is important for me and what I've been noticing in my reporting, I was up in Lincolnshire the end of last week speaking to people about some of these issues that we're touching on today. And I think what I found really interesting is that most people I speak to are in support of net zero, but they have particular problems about the siting of this solar farm, or these pylons, or how net zero is being interpreted. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind and refrain from this idea that I don't know. I think often in these circles we sort of communications professionals and lobbyists can get stuck in this idea of everything being an ideological thing or a communications challenge, and of course it is, but at the end of the day that's not how people are living their lives. They're living day to day, and they're sort of seeing these problems and having these issues, and we can say that Reform is exploiting those concerns and those things, but it is the job of politicians to listen, and I think a lot of people just feel that they're not being listened to. And that alone is a big driving force. It goes to what you're saying about this kind of top-down, fall-in-line mentality that I think, and a general distrust of the establishment. I think that's the sense that I get from speaking to people, that's their concern, not net zero. They're not anti-climate, but they're going to listen to Reform because Reform is listening to them.
I'd be really interested to come back to that in a moment, but Roy, I wonder if you've got any comments on...
Well, what can the lawyer say to that? I mean, they've smashed it. I mean, I think a healthy distrust of the establishment has always probably been a sort of benchmark of either sanity or insanity in Britain. So we shouldn't necessarily think we're never going to get away from that, and it can have real strengths, and particularly sort of holding power to account. I think for me, what I know about is promoting development, complex development, and whether that's acting for government looking at it or acting for promoters dealing with it. And to some extent, where I've come across net zero on the other side of the coin is about whole life carbon and the role of embodied carbon and all those kind of things. And that's the kind of flip side of the policy where, Luke will know better than anyone, no good deed goes unpunished. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. You can virtue signal all you like, and actually what we're moving into now is an era where we now need to talk about substance and what it means to people. And we've had lots of time where we've been kind of holding up the ball, as they'd say in football, around quality of life. What does it mean to be part of the system that we live in? And we're talking about, in the built environment, systems change, and there's some of the challenges which go with that, which are massive, which are about supply chains, which are about how you build, what the demand is, etc. And then we've got this huge social systems change, which is sitting there, and which is about inequality, polarisation, and the formation of an underclass, effectively, who feel disenfranchised from that system and whether it benefits them. And that's the thing we spend less time talking about, which for me personally I think is a big issue. Punishing elites is a really big thing. There's an element where, whole life carbon and some of those debates, they are totally valid, and it's actually the right challenge for industry. But at the same time, it's kind of like the new nukes. I don't want that there, let's just find a way to kill it and then have a load of hysteria about it. Obviously that's dismissive, but I spend my time going through planning inquiries to then pass out. And quite often people who are objecting to these things have a really good point, and you have to deal with that at a planning inquiry. But on the flip side of that, and that's to exactly the point Jillian was talking about, that when we look at the externalities, the impacts of development, and then we're weighing those up, and I think the false choice that communities have been sold over the last decade or so is totally wrong, because it says to them, you're in control, you've got choices about this, and for many, many things they should have, but for some of the really big strategic, big ticket stuff that matters to society to drive standards of living, then they don't. And that's about energy security, it's about cost of living, and how, and we'll come on to this, I think, in later questions, but how you actually make people feel like they are benefiting from the system they're operating in. And if they don't, then it's incumbent on all of us who are sitting here in London, who've got good jobs, etc., to recognise that if you've got people who are basically dispossessed, they will lash out, they will punish elites, they'll punish the system, they'll vote for certain things like they've done over the years, and they'll lash out at net zero, they'll lash out at gender equality, they'll lash out at whatever. And this is just one of those things to some extent. So there's a much wider issue that we've all got to deal with, I think, where we do need to talk about whether we live in a society with social mobility, whether we are becoming a more unequal society, and how we deal with all those kind of things. Speaking to people earlier about community energy projects and how you actually get money back into people's pockets, how you build homes that mean that people have got a radically less bill, or fewer energy bills. Or, more importantly, given that the majority of our stock, 80% of it, is going to continue to be stuff that's already here, how we actually deploy some very scarce resources to go in and retrofit, to actually give people something that changes their lives in terms of massively reducing their energy bills. Once we do that, you turn the corner, you're just pushing at the open door, and you've got a minority of people whinge on the outside. But until we can get to that, and Luke persuades the Chancellor to open the taps for fiscal measures to unlock vast swathes of money to do community retrofit, then we've got a real problem.
It's really interesting because I can't personally think of any policy areas which we've got polled in at Cavendish that shows that nearly half of people feel that net zero policies will be bad for their pockets, basically. But still, the overwhelming majority of people support net zero policies. I can't really think of many other areas where there's that same pattern happening, really. But Jillian, as I mentioned, you touched on a really interesting point there, and also, as you kind of referenced, worked in the energy industry for a long time, reporting on it, from the Daily Telegraph to the Guardian, different ends of the political spectrum.
They were different ends of the political spectrum. They're sort of bookended now, in the middle of many ridiculous.
I'll pass that on.
No, don't worry, the Telegraph's been more extreme.
But it'll be interesting to hear about whether you've seen a difference in the way people approach you, pitch stories to you, the sorts of things that are landing in your inbox, particularly over the last half a year, really, as this anti-net zero narrative has been growing.
Yeah, I think, there's a huge change. People who wouldn't speak to me when I was working at the Telegraph, you move to the Guardian, suddenly you're their best friend. People who used to speak to me, when I was there, now, won't return my calls. You do see a big shift. And I think every journalist should keep in mind that people are speaking to the chair you're sitting in most of the time. It's not about you. So yeah, the chair I'm currently sitting in at the Guardian attracts a lot of green pictures into my inbox every week. I think what I see is a lot of unhelpful characterization of this sort of net zero war. And I think there's a lot of people who actually want this kind of culture war element because they see themselves as being on the right side of history and fighting the good fight. And just personally, I found that quite unhelpful in a story pitch because I don't think that's what we should be trying to do with this debate. I think the more polarised things become, the more ideological, the less likely we are to get the actual solutions and take things down from this kind of sort of culture war level down to just practical solutions that can get things done. So I find that quite unhelpful, and maybe that's ratcheted up in the last 6 months. But to be honest, I think on the green side, it's always been quite like that. And I think maybe if you're at the Telegraph, you're seeing people more emboldened on the anti-net zero side than they were. We at least when I was there, you'd have people saying, well, of course we agree with the direction of travel, but shouldn't we do it like this or like that? I don't know. It does seem like maybe people are being a bit more brazen about their opposition because they can sort of sense a kind of turning of the tides, maybe. But
can I ask? Sorry, is that because that's how you got to sell copy these days? I mean, it's like not clickbait, but how do you sell media these days, and does that mean naturally that you're sort of heading towards more extreme positions just to get people to engage with something and read beyond the picture or the byline. You know?
I think, yeah, I'll be speaking, you know, for about my former employer now more than the Guardian, which doesn't have a commercial model in that sense. But I think I don't know. It's easy to be cynical, right? It's easy to say, oh, they're going for clickbait. But, you know, the flip side of that is saying, well, they're giving their readers what they want and what they're concerned about. I think that's what every journalist is trying to do. They're trying to identify what's important, what resonates. And in publishing now, what we're seeing is a greater focus on subscribers. I mean, certainly, you know, if you're running a subscriber business model, that's what you're looking at. And we've got an enormous amount of data that underpins that. So you can see, you know, how many page views you're getting, where they're coming from, how long people are spending on any given story, how much they're sharing it. You know, is this story the story that's going to make someone subscribe? Is this story the one, oh, fine, I'll register? You know, it's those, all of that data informs editorial strategy these days. So yes, I think the Telegraph is actually very, very good at giving their readers what they want. Those are some very well-served readers. If you open the Telegraph and you look at their headlines, every story you can see is for their readers. And you can see exactly why they've chosen that. And I don't think that is something that I personally would denigrate. I think, you know, people are allowed to think differently. And I really believe in everyone's right to have a different view. And I think everyone's has the right to information and stories that interest them. So I wouldn't sort of villainize the Telegraph for doing a good job. But yeah, certainly I think people... There's
loads of other stuff we can villainise them for, it's fine, don't we?
Yeah. I think if something's resonating, and it's the same with reform, you know, they've noticed genuine concerns and genuine dissent. And, you know, those people's views aren't worth less than the views of people who agree. They deserve to be heard like everybody else. So,
sorry, there is an interesting kind of tension there with the Telegraph, and, you know, every story on the website is kind of served for its readers, and absolutely people are entitled to different views, but not different facts, which does come out, I think, of the Telegraph sometimes, and the amount of corrections that they have to issue, especially on net zero, is quite high. And I think there is a tension there with the media in particular. And I think, you know, we could say similar about all outlets, is that, you know, absolutely you should serve your readers and you should give people kind of what they want to read, and, you know, the whatever model, kind of financial model you're following. I know it's a hard landscape for media, especially legacy media. But I do think that there is also a responsibility to if you are a news outlet, to report the news and to report clear facts as well. And I think that they don't always fall on the right side of the line there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like that should go without saying, that journalists are sort of being factually correct. I remember when I was working there, sort of picking up, you know, a lot of the columnists, the stuff, and it's just like, but that's just not right. And I would take that internally to our sort of compliance guys and say, but, you know, we can't be publishing this when this is wrong. And I would always be told, like, find the facts that are incorrect, show us the evidence that it's wrong, and we'll do a correction immediately. Like, that is the policy. You know, they abide by ipso. And it's, for anyone who's trying to do this, it's actually quite difficult, because a load of correct facts can still present something that I wouldn't consider to be true. And I think that is more often what people pick up on than actual factual inaccuracies, because those do have to be taken seriously and they are corrected relatively quickly. But there's a lot more of interpretation.
Yeah, and ipso doesn't regulate for emissions, right?
Well, I think you know, if the end result is misleading, if it's wrong, then it's wrong. But yeah, it's an interpretation thing, and I think one thing I would say, just on this, sorry, we're sort of off on a bit of a tangent, but just as an aside, I see a lot of people on like sort of Twitter and social networks making these claims, and sort of, you know, the big Twitter thread about why this piece is so wrong. If you know, take that to the paper. I think a lot of people kind of do these big sort of performative takedowns, and they're not actually going to the paper and doing an official complaints process. That is effective. Newspapers do have to take that seriously. They don't have to take your tweets seriously, or your X posts, or whatever we call them But yeah, if people do see things that are wrong, factually inaccurate, then yeah, the best thing to do is take it to the paper, do it through official channels. That's accountability.
But I think what you say about going to the root cause, and actually, as a lawyer particularly, you see when you're making your own case, and I always say to clients, be careful, don't believe your own case too much, because you may well be right. We'll believe in this project, and it's just got to happen. Let's just go around the other side of the mirror and just have a look at it from the other perspective. And someone's always got a good point. There's always a good point. Okay, yes, what we're doing in planning is trying to weigh things up and all the rest of it, but ultimately, I think seeing it from the other side, and to exactly your point around this polarisation of debates and things like that, and I think obviously as a politician it's very difficult presumably to be involved in that, and I think what Luke was saying earlier about, start with the positive and actually, let's focus on that. But I do think, it's important that we do talk about the root causes of these issues that people are experiencing, why they're in pain, and then you look at how those things get dealt with. I mean, sometimes it's just like, I don't want development near me because I don't want it, and that's fine, everyone wants that, and that's been the case since, someone decided to put up the Colosseum. That has been going through history. They took down a massive churchyard to build St Pancras Station. I mean, fine, it was really controversial. There's all sorts of stuff like that over time. That is, you've got to respect the way that the process is run, but that's life. We used to have loads of windmills. There aren't windmills now, and then people say, we're putting up a wind farm, it's terrible. It's like, we're living in a sort of artificial post-industrial landscape in many areas, so let's have a proper debate about that. But actually, if people are already in a position of pain where in their lives they don't have access to those high-tech jobs because it's all in different geographies, all of those kind of things, and actually, the household energy bills are still getting shafted on that, then we don't expect them to be nice to people who've got a moral crusade on other grounds, and we shouldn't all expect people to tell the truth and all the rest of it. And that's never been the case. In print media, there's always been about theatre, Fleet Street Quarter, which I'm the chair of the business improvement district there. Guys started out printing papers in the churchyard basically, and then it became this huge industry. And how we communicate's always been horribly controversial, and it's great, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's enjoy it, but let's not pretend that actually, there's one source of the truth, and how very dare you, because we'll burn up so much energy being outraged that actually if we go in and we say, look, I'm going to sell you something really compelling vision of the future here, and I think that's where we get to allowing our politicians to tell us what the vision is, and create that positive vision of the future, which is what we've been missing. We don't have that big tent where people say, yeah, there's loads of downsides here, but to be honest, what we're signed up for is the thing that the majority of people are up for, which is that thing over there. Let's head that direction, and we don't have that New Jerusalem at the moment, I don't think.
Yeah.
And Jillian, as you've alluded to, sometimes the practical realities on the ground, you feel there's a slight disconnect from the way we communicate it. So it'd be interesting to hear. I know you mentioned before that you quite often have campaign groups who may be lobbying against a wind farm being built or a solar farm being built in their local area and so on and so forth. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about some of the trends that you're seeing in some of the, what makes them so disgruntled or angry.
Yeah. I think what I found interesting is, I've seen it like a lot of people do. NIMBYism is like, well, you don't want your area to change. You've got an emotional connection to the way that things are, and you don't want change. And I think that's true, and I also think that that's valid. That's not something to sort of dismiss. But from speaking to people last week, I got this, sort of a very kind of different flavour. It was, this kind of David and Goliath dynamic almost, where they were seeing, the interests of big business are being favoured over kind of ordinary people. And that came through quite strongly. There was one woman who said, well, if you want solar, why isn't every commercial building in the country, mandated to have rooftop solar? Why isn't, every car park, why aren't house builders told that they have to, this is all sort of in the works, isn't it? But, why isn't that already the case, that house builders have to have, very high efficiency standards and rooftop solar? If that's what the government really believes, then why aren't they forcing those big landlords and house builders to be doing that? Why are they, telling us that we have to take one for the team? It just doesn't seem fair. And I think, and they see it as, it's like, well, because, people are going to make lots of profit from these solar farms, and we're not going to be part of that. It's something that's very much being imposed. And this isn't a net zero issue, but there's also in Lincolnshire plans for a big reservoir, which is, going to be piping water down to Cambridgeshire. This isn't something I knew about, so this was new on me. But as a community, they're just feeling quite put upon. There's all these things that we have to do for everybody else, and where is everyone else doing their side of things? Now we know, because we're all looking at all the white papers and modelling and scenarios, that actually all of those things are going to have to happen eventually to reach net zero targets. But I think for those communities that are, sort of standing there being told that, well, you jump first, we're right behind you on this, we're all going to be pulling our weight, it doesn't feel fair. And I think that's there's a kind of economic unfairness that people are tapping into. And it goes back to that point, that you made about the establishment and sort of just being told to fall in line. I got a very real strong sense of that. And these are people who are pro-net zero, who want rooftop solar, but they don't necessarily want to be kind of losing a kind of agricultural heritage to, kind of foreign-owned energy companies putting up Chinese-made solar panels. And I can see why people would be disgruntled with that. And there's a lot of people in the green movement who would consider themselves liberal, who are actually quite intolerant of these kinds of views, and they're immediately kind of dismissed as NIMBYism. Ed Miliband made some comments at the end of, was it last year? How he's going to fight the obstructionists, the delayers, that rhetoric. If you are someone who's pro-net zero, who wants change, who wants action on climate, but doesn't want it the way it's being done, I mean, that must be so infuriating. And yeah, I think for those communities, it's a really difficult place to be.
Luke,
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree to a certain extent in that the way, you could apply this to other policy areas as well, but the way which policy has, I'll give you an example. I was at a dinner last week or the week before, and someone said, we should be really proud of our power market. We've got one of the most successful power markets in the world. And I kind of said, well, from what perspective? Because if you're a consumer or a business facing the highest electricity prices in Europe, or you look at it from a perspective of, you can compare us with Denmark, where if we had the same job creation figures and economic value creation per kind of wind farm and per unit of energy that we've produced through renewables, we'd have 100,000 more jobs and a significantly more higher GDP. And the reason I mention that is because I don't think we have focused enough on the wider benefits that this needs to bring, including, so part of that is about jobs. And I don't mean talking about selling net zero in jobs. I mean actually having policy designed so that, because another person that was at that dinner who's from like a quite famous international bank, who you wouldn't be regarded as someone necessarily who'd be kind of massively in favour of state intervention, said, over the last 15 years when the government was putting investment into wind turbines and all the rest of it, in Denmark, the same person would have received the call from the government to say, and we would like this to go with the investment. And in Denmark, they got the call very quickly, and in the UK, the call never came. They never said, we want these jobs or this benefit for the community. And that is a real problem. But I also think there's another part of this, and Megan hosted, and LSEF hosted a really positive event with Ed Miliband a few weeks ago around community ownership and ensuring that communities genuinely have a stake. I think there's something really important, and I don't think that will win everyone over. Like, there are some people who say, well, I'm pro-housing, and some of them actually will never accept housing or some development in their area, and that's always been the case. But there is another group of people who I think are, genuinely, as you say, are supportive of whatever agenda it is, whether it's development, housing development, energy infrastructure, but actually would benefit from, and we would all benefit from, them having that kind of greater stake and that community ownership. And that would benefit everyone, including the private companies who are investing, because if they, I think if private investors and private businesses don't allow for that and work with the government to help deliver that, they'll find there are much fewer opportunities in future to invest, because it will build up resistance. So I do think that community stake and community ownership and having policy alongside energy policy, I think just to go back, kind of, Jillian, you said to meet net zero targets. I mean, for me, we need to get, I mean, I know that's how we think, but actually we're not doing it to meet net zero targets. We're doing it to create a better world and ensure that we don't get taken over by the quite massive impacts of climate change. So we need to remember why we're doing it, and you should have policies that ensure that people feel like they're part of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Roy, you have something to chip in there?
Yeah, no, I think I'm just on that last point. I mean, energy security, which I think someone mentioned right at the outset, I think possibly Luke, that's a massive part of this. We know that there's a different conversation taking place about the defence of the realm, basically, that even than there was 2 years ago. We are in a rather different place. I think energy security is really important. Diversified energy supply is incredibly important. Demand reduction and other sources of production, those two things go hand in hand. We've talked a lot about the alternative sources and some of the impacts people don't like about those. The demand reduction side is really important, but both of those should be about, fundamentally, there's a benefit. There will be a benefit to you really, really soon, or it's already happening, in terms of your cost of living. Because, as I said previously, don't expect people to say, oh yeah, I love this system. Whatever it is we're meant to be getting out of the system, in terms of an industrial commercial sort of society, if that isn't happening through a significant number of people, and we're talking about progression in terms of quality of life, then, well, actually you're going to get a kickback. So we do need to work out how you do that. When we talk about community benefits for renewable development, it's really tricky. I mean, I would just say don't use the planning regime, because it's proved to be completely possible to do that. Planning is meant to be about just taking a view about land use and then saying, is it the right thing to do? Is that why we're going to do it? And if there's a point about persuasion, obviously, the whole point about the planning system is you take that out of the system. And community benefits have always had a problematic relationship with the sort of this quote called buying and selling planning permission. I know there are some proposals around doing that now, but I think the more we do it outside the planning system, and to the point that's been made around a different conversation through different systems with people who are going to be doing this, which is, look, if you come and do this, all right, then outside the planning system, we as political leaders will do our very best to make sure you get what you need from development consenting. But what you need to do is X, Y, and Z, and we need to see that. And there's fiscal routes to doing that, there's other routes to doing that, and planning is not the best delivery model for doing that. And I think that's challenging. And then the other part of it is about retrofit, which is the much bigger challenge here, which is how do you get money back into people's pockets? It's fine. 20% of housing stock, projected housing stock, will be new build. That's fine. You've talked to Thacum, who I was talking to. They're a great sort of SME developer, house builder, lovely housing stock. They're doing deals with people like Octopus, where they'll put solar panels on the roof, and then people who go into that property, because it's been fabricated to a level which is not quite passive house, but it's like very energy efficient, demand reduction, alternative supply built in. And they don't have any energy bills for 5 to 10 years. That's the deal with Octopus if you buy that house. So that's how you sell that component. Now, how many of us can be lucky enough to buy one of those houses? That's for a very small number of people. And pointing to those and saying that's what you should be up for when you're living in a very different situation is really hard. Retrofitting and providing incentives for people where the feed-in tariff works better, where the actual way that they get their energy within their domestic energy and how well insulated their homes are, that is what we need to deal with. And if you look at the most recent reports, it was parliamentary report most recently, there was in January, I think they were saying, that's where we're lagging, basically. We're doing quite well on some measures of domestic energy efficiency measures for new buildings, but where we're falling back is on that retrofit side of things. And that's much more difficult to have a conversation about. And if you're saying, look, do this stuff over here, but we're going to, outside the planning regime, dare I say it, tax you or impose some kind of charge which says, we'll give you the fastest track that you can get from the planning regime, but there's a price tag for that, and we're going to take those funds, do what the Treasury doesn't always like doing, which is hypothecate them for actually really going there now on the community retrofit. Those are the kind of things which are I would say would begin to move the dial.
Megan, I wonder if you have any thoughts just to round off this part of the discussion, really.
I mean, I think it's interesting, this kind of dimension of especially local opposition and the kind of the builders versus blockers language that's come out of government, and it's kind of waned, I think, because I think there was a sort of high point, and that's kind of fallen off, which I'm glad to see, because I don't think it was helpful. The sort of the builders versus blockers language. I mean, you know, I'm very much I guess what you could classify as a builder, but it's also it's true that there is an enormous push, rightly, for growth and for planning, kind of new planning regulation, or less planning regulation, to be able to kind of kickstart the energy infrastructure, the housing, the public transport infrastructure that we need across the country. But when we talk about blockers, we are a lot of the time we're talking about kind of retirees who like bird watching, to be blunt. Like, we're talking about normal people in normal constituencies across the country, and framing them as like an enemy of growth is really reductive and really problematic. And I think I'm really glad to see that the government's moved away from that. I think that language still persists in certain quarters, and I kind of go, I don't know, you know, I don't think you've picked the correct enemy here. And actually, I would say that some of the kind of anti-big business stuff, the stuff that Reform is doing, that's cutting through, more speaks to the heart of kind of why these sort of so-called blockers are frustrated. I think the good news is that there are things that local political representatives can be doing to ease some of these frustrations. And I agree that the kind of the sort of social contract, as it were, needs to be better articulated to communities in terms of kind of what you give and what you get. Community benefit needs to be worked out, and so on. Non-fungible community benefits, not just putting money into people's pockets, but also having kind of developers investing in like parks and infrastructure and roads and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also just having like good, like best practice within the kind of development sector. You know, even things like the local primary school has their summer fair on a Thursday afternoon, so maybe you could like cease the noise for a little bit, or maybe you could not do kind of HGVs down small country roads at the exact time that there's school pickup, because it backs people up for 45 minutes and they get really angry about it. You know, these are like small things that sound really, really petty and ridiculous, but actually all politics is local, and having kind of local best practices about how people feel about change in their area is really important. And it's not as kind of like sexy as sort of like national change and growth and builders versus blockers, but it is much more emotionally resonant, I think, with everyday communities.
Yeah, of course. And it's about we kind of need to be bringing these communities on a journey with us, whatever the kind of rhetoric that's being used to sell it.
Just trying to not piss people off, I think, is a golden rule.
And so, kind of within the context of the narrative that we've been discussing here, Roy, and also the wider discussion on this panel, I'm interested to hear about how you, like, whether it's impacted, and if so, how you advise clients, your engagement stakeholders and communities, really.
So I think this has changed hugely over the last 5 years, and probably even just within that, in terms of the role of elements of net zero. So my experience is much more around delivering regeneration schemes and how we kind of reimagine towns and cities. In that area, the role of whole life carbon, embodied carbon, how we build, that's completely changed, and M&S ended up at this kind of bleeding edge of that. And it actually was quite a poor case study because of the nature of the actual site and the buildings it had. But it was just an incident showing how if you adopt policies which are very absolute and you don't have any transitional arrangement for things that were being applied for or submitted, while those policies are being gestated, you end up with people being rubbed up against the propeller. And so one of the things we've got to think about is how we make policy, how we provide transitional periods, and that's not as sexy to go out there and say, we made this policy and this is what we're going to bash everyone around the head with, and that's our political clickbait or whatever. Policy, I think we're in a much, much better place in terms of planning, in terms of, we had these years and years of what I've referred to as sort of policy-making gaslighting. We're just constantly bombarding people with policy change so that they're spending their whole time trying to respond to totally crazed policy stuff, and actually not saying, look, what's our consensus position? Like, we're in different bits of the industry, what do we all believe in? And I think we're in a much better place now about sensible policy making, and trying to have a sort of grown-up dialogue about things. But I think built environment, the sector is taking responsibility, its own ESG credentials and what that means to investors and occupiers of buildings, completely different to where it was 5, certainly 10 years ago. And I think, if you're promoting trophy assets, big buildings, actually those, it's a no-brainer. You've got to deliver a great product that has those ESG credentials. But we then look at like the majority of other schemes, and that's where the reality is. It's not just that sort of 10% of really big projects. As I said, there's this kind of new newt component of like whole life carbon, which is just a way to kind of delay and block projects. Equally, on the other side of it, there's a really good point, which is, do you need to knock that building down to achieve what we should be doing? But we've got to have that conversation, particularly in the way that local policies are put together. That we don't just have these policies which are kind of virtue signalling and not dealing with the reality, which is particularly in the part of London that we're sitting in. I participated in the Westminster local plan examination in public a few weeks ago. That policy has been amended several times now during the examination process to get something which I believe is much more pragmatic and it's not just about virtue signalling, because this is meant to be one of the growth engines of London and the UK. And you can't lose sight of that. And at the same time, we've got heritage, townscape factors. Just keeping a building that looks disgusting because it's the least carbon intensive thing to do in this particular location is not the right thing to do. So let's have sensible conversations. I think we'll get there. I think we've got the right system to be able to do it. I think that in relation to renewables, we've had a moratorium period on onshore, and now we're getting back into all the same conversations and debates that we've kind of blocked off completely artificially for a decade, effectively. We've got to have those debates, but at the end of the day, as people have said, there's got to be something, cavalry have got to be coming around on that, which is, if we do this, these things will happen and they're good. I believe you do that outside the planning regime, and I totally agree with what's been said around not just codes of practice, but like when these things get done, that's how they get done, and government is doing its part of that social compact and being strong in relation to, I suppose, investors. Investors, if they think, well, okay, fine, that's fine. If we just know how long it's going to take us to get a decision on the planning side, you're telling us that what you need as politicians is to show strength in these other areas, then they may well just say that's okay. So I think that you should be trying to sell your scheme credentials. I mentioned residential, strategic land. Those people are very up for doing that. I think the building technologies are there. Supply chains are not there, and I think the sort of systems change that you need across the building industry is massive. But we should be up for that. But what it should fundamentally be is about, if you are a contractor, you're being asked to do it by the developer's asking you to do it because, there's a sort of regulatory nudge, but also it's going to save them money. And we're not in the place yet where the economics have tipped over. Obviously, the costs of delivering anything are much higher than they were. But, if you, just taking a whole life carbon example, take materials away, hold on to them, and then reuse them in that or another project, you've got to store them somewhere. You've also got to do R&D on, like, if we take all the steel out of this, then let's play around with it and see what happens. What can we do? We've got to have a space to do that. Should there be somewhere in London that's a plot of land where you can get stuff down a barge off these huge construction sites, fiddle around with the steel that's stored there, see what works, and then you can take that back into the supply chain. And that gives, and use SMEs to be doing that, creating jobs, and in a way that then actually takes contractors to a different place. I mean, don't expect contractors who are working on skinny margins to go off and do a whole load of R&D on some of this stuff. So there's all sorts of things like that, and I think there are areas where government can show leadership in that space, and is, but we need to invest in those components of it, and those things all have a job creation to it, and we shouldn't lose sight that all of this ultimately should come down to there are jobs here, there's progress here, and there's a benefit that will come to you. And if you can't, I don't think if you can't explain it in those terms, you should worry quite a lot.
Well, as you've kind of mentioned there, and as you alluded to earlier, Luke, I wonder if maybe we need to start reframing how we communicate net zero to focus more on the economic benefits and almost position the environmental benefits, the reduced emissions, better air quality, so on and so forth, almost as positive byproducts rather of the broader economic benefits that's to come. I wonder if you've got any comments on that.
I actually think it's the opposite.
Is it right?
I actually all of the polling evidence. So the difference is for me is you actually need to deliver the economic benefits, not talk about them. Green jobs don't mean anything to anyone. Like it's big numbers that lots of people like to talk about, but actually people want to see local jobs created, good quality jobs, high skill created in their local area, and they want to see the tangible benefits. I genuinely think it's nothing to do with the communication of like making the argument around it being economic. Actually, the strongest arguments that you see in all of the polling work that's done by More in Common, Persuasion, YouGov, all the work that I did at IPPR, is that the strongest arguments are the emotive arguments. They are leaving a planet that's better for people's kids and their grandkids. It's security, and energy security, because that is a motive. People care about that. That goes to a deep sense of wanting to keep your family and your country safe. And that's why the energy security argument is so powerful, rightly, because we shouldn't be reliant on dictators like Putin and the volatile fossil fuel markets internationally. Homegrown renewable power provides us with that security in the future. Yes, we need to get it right. And a love of nature, and Megan was talking about it there as well, about the retired bird watchers, or people want they enjoy seeing green space, they want to have access to it. Those are the things that move people. Talking about the co-benefits actually have very little impact in messaging terms. What people actually want is for us to deliver them, not talk about them. That's what I would say.
You were nodding along there in the background. I wonder if you've got any further comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with Luke, and I think that we should absolutely be talking about the things that are less difficult to prove. So, how do you know when you don't have energy security? You don't know when you do have it. I mean, some people feel the impact, but you don't necessarily know that the air that you're breathing is cleaner, or that the water you're drinking is cleaner. You have to do public messaging campaigns around that, but you have to deliver it first. I think it's really tricky with the kind of, whether we should lean heavily on the economics, and I absolutely agree with Luke. I think that we kind of had somebody described it to me as a consumer journey in a panel yesterday, which is not really how I think about politics, but this kind of consumer journey, if you like, about net zero and climate change, which was making them understand the kind of the scale of what it is, the challenge that we're facing, and then saying, oh, well, actually we can do something about it, and then actually doing the thing. And we had this kind of sort of from the late noughties, early 2010s, there was this journey that the country was going on. And in the last 5 years, that journey's been severely disrupted, as we talked about kind of the fracturing of climate consensus. And now this government has to both deliver very, very quickly, but also communicate, once again, the challenge to continue to reiterate the messaging, to keep public support on side, and then to communicate the fact that this ambition is possible, and then to deliver it. And that is enormously chunky. And I think like what comes out of Desnes, you can really see in that pre-election, everybody was going, well, is clean power by 2030 even achievable? Can we even do it? You have to win the argument for why, and then you have to win the argument for your ambition, and then you have to win the argument that your ambition is achievable, and then achieve it, and then tell people how you're doing it and how it's been done. And I think that we're trying to do kind of 4 layers of communications on climate all at once at the moment. And I don't think that is impossible, but I do think it requires a lot of different voices, a lot of real voices, and representatives and industry and media kind of pulling together in that kind of same target. Otherwise it'll fracture and disintegrate, basically.
Well, I'd like to wrap up to see if there's any questions from the audience, really, for any of our panellists in particular. Got one straight back here. That's right, you've got a microphone just behind you as well.
I'm Sarah Costin-Sir Winston from the Energy Efficiency Infrastructure Group. We represent the home upgrade retrofit supply chain.
I'm not sponsored by them, I should just say that.
not at all. Basically, a lot of this is about consumer trust. There's a huge amount of distrust. The messages coming from government, also the industry, and actually getting what it says on the tin. So, basically we have a retrofit journey. There should be a good retrofit journey. But at the moment, we have policy that's pushing out measures, It's not looking at homes and actually the outcomes of those good outcomes of those homes. We've looked at it slightly differently and think we've got to flip it on its head. And whatever tech and measures go into those homes, they should be proven. They should be working. So we call it the outcomes-based approach. So every home can actually have that, whether it's a heat pump, whether it's solar PV, whether it's insulation, to get those genuinely lower bills and low carbon. But the way policy works now, that is not happening. And that will actually impact the fuel poor, the low income, those most vulnerable in society, and it concerns us greatly. So we did a little bit of modelling on the UK GBC retrofit calculator. Very interesting thing to be doing late at night, but great to be playing around with figures. Basically combining a clean heat and power, plus a strong drive for home insulation upgrades, could actually cut electricity generation costs by 150 billion over 25 years. And if we do the proven outcomes, the meter measuring, monitoring side of things, that would double. So why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we filtering policy to make sure it's actually outcomes based?
Would you like to try and kick this one off?
I think that is what the government is trying to get to through its Warm Homes Plan. I think will, and you know, I think we'll see that in October and November. I think it's listening to the industry. I think you're right in the sense that we need to focus on the things that are going to benefit the system, but also consumers and householders the most. So I think ultimately that's what policy should be. So if it's not, then yeah, let's have a conversation.
Because that's not happening.
Okay.
I think what you say about trust is super important. I know we talked about that in our event just before the spending review, in which obviously the Warm Homes Plan got a big boost, which was very nice to see. But this thing about trust, and as we talked about then, I think is really important when it comes to something like retrofit. I think every single homeowner has the experience of calling somebody up to come and fix something in their home and it not being done properly and paying like £450 for the privilege. And it is really annoying and it makes you feel really mugged off and it makes you feel really stupid. And there's very little accountability for it. You know, you can't call anyone, you can't complain. Like it makes people feel quite angry, I think, especially when money is tight and you know your boiler's not working and it's the depth of winter, etc., etc. I think the problem that could happen with some of the kind of the retrofit schemes and has happened previously, but when the government is owning it as such an enormous delivery on cost of living and on climate, which they rightly should, is that you rely on kind of self-employed tradespeople and construction firms and so on and so forth to do that retrofitting. And we need to, in my opinion, have a kind of trust mark standard that the government signs up on, or that local authorities sign up on, or CMAs, or whoever it is, because essentially if we have problem where people have retrofit done to their homes and that's been like signed off and ticked off by the government and the government says it's really good and it doesn't go right, then they're not only blaming the person who's come into their home and done something that's not quite right, but they're blaming the government for messing up essentially. And I think this issue, and sort of goes back to what we were talking about codes of practice, this kind of trust mark thing is really, really interesting and something that we definitely should be looking at more closely.
It already exists in the industry. Yep. So we have Heat Geek, that basically they're brilliant, you know, they will come back and change something that's not right within the home. We already have that in the industry, but we need government to support that.
Yeah.
Because you don't need all the other stuff is then just tick box. We can actually do it as an industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that accountability I think is really important for people to feel like if something goes wrong, there is accountability, which goes back to sort of what we were saying about developers and change in general, I think.
A few questions, I think. I know you had your hand up earlier as well, so I'll come to you first.
Hello, I'm Nicola Pitts. I work for the Independent Networks Association, who represent independent electricity, gas and water companies. The electricity companies connect from wind farms and data centres all the way down to new homes, so are very interested in the whole regulatory environment. I've been having some very interesting conversations recently. The Welsh Government has its the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act, and also talking about the review of Ofgem, perhaps focusing a bit more on future consumers rather than just consumers now. And really, we've been down a path of least cost infrastructure, which has created some issues. I suppose I'm not feeling very confident that we can pivot, given the discussion, to perhaps a slightly higher cost, given the additional things that may need to be funded. So it's more of a jam tomorrow message, and I'm not sure how we can really pivot to get there. I suppose, Luke, you said, we're in the crunchy bit now.
But is that about grid connection and, or it's about building, some of that hard infrastructure that just needs to go in, if we're going to really genuinely have a chance of doing that? Yeah, look, I think, we've got a government that's totally different around getting stuff done. And that's what's happening. That's what you see in the development industry. It's radically different. They mean business, and I don't think they're operating yet, because we're not near an election, but in a bit of a sort of cynical way. I think what we see is decision making that is responsible again and is actually focused on trying to get things happening. I think that's in the consenting sphere, and there's all sorts of efforts to try and speed up the NSIT process, and the Planning Act process as well. One of the big issues, and I know is an area, it's an entire separate topic on its own right, is how you get that sort of grid infrastructure and grid connections working. We've got something like 700 gigawatts of sort of pending, connections or demand for that. That is, I'm sure it's on the list. That's a massive challenge for society, which is how do you build the infrastructure you need to move forward. And you do need to have those conversations, which is, there'll be a lot of lorries going past here, because we need to get this done, and some of that stuff is, I think, often where it's not being sold to people as being a local decision. If there's nuclear power stations, there's only a few places where they'd go, and that's decided at national level by politicians who've been elected. That's fully accountable decision making. It may be painful, but that's how we get those things done. So I think the strategic infrastructure system, that there's a big push on that at the moment. The government's doing all the right things in that.
Thank you.
I mean, just very briefly, and then I need to go, I'm afraid, because I've got a visit in my constituency from the Minister. But I think it's always going to be a balance between figuring out around, taxpayers and bill payers today and those in the future. I think, in water, the government and the regulator have taken a difficult decision to allow water bills to rise, reflecting the fact that there has been massive underinvestment in the past. But that there is a quid pro quo there, which is there's much stricter regulation around how they can use that funding, ensuring that it's genuinely going into upgrading the sewer system and our water system, and around bonuses and things like that, and ensuring that we're not pumping kind of sewage into our rivers. So that some of those difficult decisions can be made. I think the government is taking some of those long-term decisions, and that is coming with some political pain. I think, as we've talked about, some of the language aside, some of the actual decisions will be difficult in terms of delivering the housing and the energy infrastructure, and we've got to find ways to make sure that we bring people with us, of course, but that doesn't mean it won't be difficult. But those are decisions that will benefit both people today, but also those in the future as well. On Ofgem, I think the truth is we will have to have a ruthless focus on how we can take out costs in other parts of the bill. And I think there are parts we can, and we need to focus on that and find ways to bring down costs as well. And that is incredibly difficult, but that means we need to be focused on how we can build the infrastructure we need, but we also need to figure out how we can try and ease that for consumers, because those are the kind of things that people they feel that more than their taxes, because it's something that's like your council tax bill. Well, maybe less so now, but it literally gets delivered through the post. You sit there and look at the bill and think, wow, that's a lot of money. So we do need to be really sensitive to that and figure out how we can get costs down, while also, as you're saying, thinking about future bill payers as well as current ones as well.
Thanks very much. Appreciate you saying over and
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you. So we have time for a couple more questions. Let's come to Bean first.
I need to give this back.
Beanland Heat Pump Federation, we have quite a big community engagement programme, and one of the problems that I perceive is that we talk a lot about solutions when the vast majority of people don't actually realise they've got a problem. I don't think we've spent anything like enough time persuading people of the importance of the energy transition. And if you try and push a solution at somebody who doesn't think they've got a problem, actually you are hacking them off. And so I think we're creating part of the backlash ourselves, because I do worry that even with our audiences who are self-selecting, so they've already got one foot in the camp, even there we choose now to spend about 75% of the time talking about the energy transition as a whole. So I describe it like going out to dinner. You have a main course of energy transition and a side salad of heat pumps. Because even that demographic wants to understand much more about the energy transition and why it's important, what the timeframes are involved, what their implications are for them, their neighbours, their neighbourhood, before you start talking to them about the solutions.
Anyone like to come in on that?
I mean, I think this is, I sort of agree. It goes back to kind of what I was saying about that kind of consumer journey, about making people understand, you know, but it's very hard to communicate to people the kind of a crisis. It really is. And especially when a lot of it is also so linked with kind of global supply chains and kind of like future looking. I think that there is an argument with something like heat pumps saying, you know, yeah, it's a big upfront cost. The government will give you £7,500 to help with that. They've scrapped the 1 metre rule, so you can now put it on your home if you live in, say, a Victorian terraced house in North London. And also it'll bring it down your bills substantially, and it's good for the planet and it's good for you. Pardon?
Guaranteed it will bring down your bills.
At the moment,
Yeah.
it won't bring down your bills.
Exactly.
But also there's a fixation. There's a current fixation on single air source monoblocks. And that isn't the solution for everybody.
So I'm not going to respond on that. I'm going to respond on your previous point, to not get into air source heat pumps, which I spend too much time talking about. But on the communications point, I do think that you have to, sometimes it's just about selling the benefits and selling the products themselves. And of course there are conflicting opinions on which products, etc., and I don't want to...
It's not conflicting, it's together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in terms of selling the benefits rather than focusing on the crisis, I think it can be really powerful as well. And there are always people who are going to say, well, that crisis has got nothing to do with me, you know, sort of like floods around the world or even floods in Yorkshire, they've got nothing to do with me, even though they're climate impacts that we're seeing right now. It's very hard to explain how all of these different systems link together, and why it is that when we talk about nature, we're actually talking about farming, and we're talking about food security, and we are talking about the way that people eat and can afford to eat in this country. There's enormous consumer journeys to take people through, and actually you can just say to them, this is cheaper, or this is better, or, you know, this will, you know, even just this is better for your kids.
I think the point you're making is that it's not cheaper at the moment because actually
in my world it's not cheaper at the moment because of successive government policy over the last 50 years, frankly. We've got ourselves into a right mess, and it's probably going to take us 50 years to get out of it. But I think the point here is, and I don't like to talk of it as a crisis, because I don't think that's helpful either. You know, I shared a platform with someone from Extinction Rebellion, and she told people to take their children out because she was about to scare them. That's not helpful. So talk of crisis, I think, is not helpful as well. I think we're much more, we should be much more in the territory of describing to people how the energy transition is actually going to improve their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, air quality, we talked about air quality, you know, in London there was a projection that by 2030, the single biggest cause of NOx and particulates in central London would be the burning of gas. We're there already. You know, 2025, we're already there, 5 years early. Nobody knows that. Nobody understands that they're pouring NOx and particulates into their own homes with gas hobs and gas boilers. You know, that doesn't, you know, we're not yet talking about the improvements to the quality of life that could come from the energy transition in anything like enough, in my view. It's all about PV, heat pumps, you know, these are the solutions. Actually, we need to describe what the future is going to look like before we start talking about the solutions.
Just from a sort of reader point of view, I just wanted to say, because heat pumps is a huge driver of traffic for The Guardian. It's absolutely massive. And I don't think it's just The Guardian. And The Telegraph,
I'm a
yeah.
victim of that culture war.
Well, yeah,
You know,
but
my
it's...
podcast was canned
as a culture war, as a cultural
Yeah.
issue?
It's really big, but the caveat is, if I write a story about heat pump policy, that does okay, but it's the heat pump pieces that are about more like a how-to news you can use. Like, how does it actually work? What do you actually need to do? You know, what does it mean for my bills? That very usable content is what absolutely flies. Stories about kind of the policy, you know, frameworks and levers that the government is pulling don't get nearly as much attention. And I take this to mean that people are interested. People are extremely heat pump curious. And they want to know how. How can I, as a individual person in this giant crisis, play my part? And should I? And does it make sense for me to do so? And I think, as you say, for a lot of people, it doesn't make sense for them to do so at the moment. And so they're not.
And yet they feel it's being pushed at them. That's the challenge.
Yeah.
They feel it's being pushed, even though it doesn't actually make good
Well,
sense.
yeah, some people feel that it's being pushed on them. Some people, are quite anxious to get involved and sort of play their part. It just depends what paper you're reading. But I think, there is a big difference there. And I think the solutions and the how to do it is really resonating with people. I think they do want the solutions. I'm not sure that the kind of wider policy context and what is the carbon saving contribution to the ultimate end goal is actually interesting to people. I think they get it. A gas boiler is fossil fuels, heat pump is not, and then their reaction kind of stems from that.
But unless there's an economic driver, then people generally won't do things.
You can't.
I mean, my parents put solar panels on their house because they had a really good feed-in tariff at the time, which then got canned. I mean, guess what? And so actually, that is, don't have the MP here anymore. But that's the challenge: is that how do you create fiscal or equivalent incentives for people to say, I just really want a heat pump because it's going to create some kind of economic, gain or reduce my bills, or I'm going to get a tariff that counts. And that's where we've sort of set ourselves back. I know it's really easy to say that, but ultimately, unless there's a reason to do it, there's not a moral reason, it's not going to happen, and we shouldn't expect it to. People just won't bother. So how do we create an economic incentive that's really, really compelling, and the rest of it will follow? And unfortunately that does involve tax dollars in some form, but if that is about persuasion with the government, or the work that sort of other people, not me, are involved in around the fact that, that will create a supply chain of this, that will create employment here. What are largely historically have been terribly unsuccessful arguments with Treasury about the fact that if you do this, that and the other, it will offset joblessness costs and things like that, but that's where we've got to go, it seems to me, because actually it's those things which are successful in getting a lot of renewable infrastructure added to people's domestic curtilages, and that's what we're missing at the moment. People always carp about things, that's fine, but when there's a money reason to do it, they'll go out and just knock your door down and do it.
I'm afraid we do need to wrap up there. I'm conscious we've gone a little bit over, but thank you for some wonderful questions. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. And have a lovely rest of the day. We'll have the room for a bit longer, so please do mingle.
Thank you.